The fluorescent lights hummed above Seattle General's ICU like they were counting down something nobody else could hear. 3:03 in the morning, and Katie Morrison moved through the corridors the way water moves through cracks, necessary, unnoticed, gone before anyone remembered she'd been there at all. 12 hours into her shift and she'd already run 3 codes, restocked 2 trauma bays, and talked a confused patient through a panic attack without once raising her voice above a whisper. Her scrubs were still dry. Her badge was still clipped. Her hands were steady. Nobody saw that her steadiness came from muscle memory developed in a field hospital outside Bagram, where the only difference between a good decision and a dead patient was 3 seconds and a clear head. She touched the patch. Just for a moment. Her fingers found the faded unit insignia sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs like a brand mark, and she let the contact ground her the way meditation worked for other people. The embroidered Marines emblem was the last thing she owned from that life. Not her dress blues, those were boxed in a closet her 16-year-old son had never asked about. Not her medals, those were locked in a shadow box she couldn't bring herself to look at directly. Just the patch. Worn to nearly illegibility. Small enough to hide. Big enough to hurt every time she remembered why it was there. The ICU smelled like it always did at this hour, antiseptic layered over floor wax layered over the metallic tang of blood from the trauma bay 3 rooms down. Katie moved to the medication count station, her limp barely visible under the fluorescent wash. The old injury, mortar shrapnel, Sanjin Valley, 2011, only got worse during double shifts, but she'd learned not to favor it too obviously. Drawing attention was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. She was signing off on the fentanyl count when Dr. Ashford appeared beside her like he'd been waiting in the space between heartbeats. Dr. Marcus Ashford was the kind of handsome that made people forgive him things they shouldn't forgive. 52 years old with silver threading through dark hair, a jawline that could cut glass, and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a room. He'd been chief of emergency medicine at Seattle General for 8 years, and in those 8 years he'd cultivated a reputation for competence that actually was competence. He was a good doctor, which made everything worse. Bad doctors could be reported and replaced. Good doctors with connections made themselves untouchable. "Inventory looks clean," he said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, something lethal waiting at idle. Katie didn't look up from the logs. All accounted for. Everything? She hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 1 second, which was enough time for Ashford to notice. Katie's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on the clipboard. The medication discrepancies had been nagging at her for 3 weeks. Small amounts. Inconsistent patterns. Fentanyl, primarily, but also midazolam and propofol in quantities that didn't match the patient charts. She'd checked twice. The numbers just didn't hold. In the back of her mind, the part trained in military logistics and evidence preservation, a voice had been getting louder. Report it. Document it. Create a paper trail. But Katie had learned the hard way what happened when you created paper trails about the wrong people. Everything accounts, she said finally. Clean. Deferential. The voice of someone who'd made a career out of never drawing the kind of attention that destroyed carefully rebuilt lives. Ashford watched her for another 3 seconds, long enough for it to feel like pressure, short enough that nobody else would have noticed anything unusual. Then he nodded and walked back toward the attending station, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with perfect military precision. Nobody who didn't know better would have called it a military gate. But Katie knew better. She knew the weight distribution. She knew the spine straight as a telephone pole. She knew because her own spine was the same way, trained the same way, by the same institution that taught you how to break people and how to heal them and how to do both at the same time when the situation demanded it. The rest of her shift unfolded in the rhythm she'd perfected, vital signs every 2 hours, for checks every 3, the constant peripheral awareness of which monitors were trending up and which were drifting down like ships at anchor. Room for 12 needed pain management. Room for 07 was developing early sepsis signs and the attending hadn't noticed yet. Room for 15 was asking for water and the attending had specifically ordered NPO status because the imaging team was running behind. Katie brought ice chips. Never water, never disobeying orders directly, but ice chips existed in a space where the letter of the law and the spirit of the law stopped talking to each other. At 02:30, the code came through on room 408. She was there before the attending. 68-year-old male, myocardial infarction, rhythm deteriorating from VTAC to VFib at the moment the monitor alarmed. The crash cart was already rolling. The respiratory tech was moving for the room. But there was a 30-second window where Katie was the only one with two hands on the compressions, counting out loud, 1, 2, 3, 4, her voice steady as a metronome, her hands moving with the kind of surgical precision that came from having done this while actual ordnance was falling less than 200 meters away. Ashford arrived as the medication went in. 1 milligram epinephrine for push. Katie didn't step back when he took over. She shifted, redistributed her weight, and let the attending move into her space without resistance. But she watched him work. Watched how his hands moved. Watched how he calculated each medication dose and each compression cycle. Watched the moment his eyes flicked to the monitor, not at the rhythm but at something else. Something calculating. The patient converted back to sinus rhythm at minute 4. Good compressions, Ashford said, not looking at her, eyes still on the patient. Textbook rhythm response. Katie didn't respond. She was already breaking down the crash cart, restocking the medications, making sure the room reset before the next patient arrived. Her hands were steady. They always were. That was the problem, or the gift, depending on which life you counted. In Bagram, steady hands had kept 12 people alive during a firefight that lasted 47 minutes. In Portland, steady hands made her invisible. A competent night nurse. Quiet. Reliable. The kind of person whose name you forgot 5 seconds after they left the room. She was restocking the airway kit when she realized Ashford was standing in the doorway behind her. "You ever work trauma?" he asked. Katie's hands didn't pause. She was thinking about the question, how to answer it, what it meant that he was asking. Trauma work existed in a different part of her history, the part she'd spent for years burying under night shifts and careful anonymity. Emergency medicine, she said finally. General ICU support. You have good instincts. He was closer now. She could hear the precision in his breathing. Most nurses hesitate on compressions. You didn't. Muscle memory, she said. It was a risk, saying that. It was close enough to the truth to be dangerous. From where? Katie turned then, just slightly, enough to face him without meeting his eyes directly. Contract work. A few years back. It wasn't a lie. It was the kind of answer that told the truth in a way that didn't actually explain anything. Contract work could mean 1,000 different things. Disaster relief. NGO medical teams. Private hospital networks. It could mean anything except what it actually meant, which was 3 tours with the Marine Corps as a combat medical officer, 2 Purple Hearts, and a medical discharge that came with a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to use as a weapon. Ashford studied her for a moment. Then his eyes flicked to the medication station behind her, the one she'd just finished counting, the numbers that didn't add up, the inventory that was supposedly clean but wasn't. Get some rest before your next shift, he said. You look like you could use it. But that wasn't what his eyes were saying. His eyes were saying something else entirely. His eyes were saying he knew something was wrong, and his eyes were saying he was deciding whether she was a threat or an asset. His eyes were running calculations about loyalty and silence and what kind of leverage a person with a hidden history represented. Katie nodded once, a small, deferential gesture, and watched him leave the room. Her hand found the patch again, inside her jacket, against her ribs. The faded emblem of the unit she'd served with, the rank she couldn't use anymore, the life she'd traded for a 12-hour-a-night position in Portland where she could rebuild something resembling normal. But that wasn't what was happening now. Something had shifted. She'd felt it the moment Ashford asked about trauma work. She'd heard it in the precision of his breathing. She'd seen it in the way his eyes calculated the moment between her answer and his next question. The medication count was wrong. She'd known it for 3 weeks. And now Ashford had just asked her about trauma work with the kind of casual curiosity that came from someone who was sizing up whether you could be trusted or whether you needed to be eliminated. The worst part wasn't that she'd finally been seen. The worst part was that she had no idea what he was actually looking at when he looked at her, and that was the moment everything started to change. The ICU doors slid open at 6:36 a.m., and Katie Morrison felt the weight of her scrubs shift against her shoulders as she clocked in for the day's shift. The fluorescent panels overhead cast their familiar sickly glow across the unit, 12 beds, 7 occupied, one with a name on the whiteboard that stopped her cold. Brennan, SEAL Marine Sergeant. Room 4. She didn't move toward the break room. Didn't grab her assignment sheet. Just stood there with one hand on the medication cart, breathing like she'd run a mile instead of walked 30 feet from the entrance. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, faded Marine Corps insignia she'd stitched there 3 years ago with borrowed needles, and the kind of determination that comes from needing to remember who you were when everyone else decided you were nobody, suddenly burned against her ribs like a brand pressed into flesh. Cole Brennan. The name alone was enough. But seeing it there, written in Dr. Ashford's precise handwriting on the bed assignment, transformed everything. She'd known this day would come. Had fantasized about it during 2 a.m. medication checks, had rehearsed neutrality while changing bedpans, had built walls so carefully constructed that no one at Seattle General had ever glimpsed the major underneath the scrubs. But fantasies dissolved when confronted with reality, and the reality was a 34-year-old Marine sergeant lying unconscious in room 4, the same man who had signed the court-martial papers that dismantled her career 7 years ago, the same man who had sat across from her in a classified hearing room and let everything burn because someone had to be sacrificed for classified protocol she could never discuss. She moved toward the room on automatic pilot. Her body understood what her mind was still processing. If he woke up, if he recognized her, if he understood what her presence meant, everything she'd constructed would collapse like a house built on sand. The hospital knew her as a competent night shift nurse who kept her head down and followed protocol. Her background was filed away as prior medical experience on her employment forms. Nothing more. Nothing that would trigger a second glance or a cross-reference database search that might lead someone to ask questions about why a major had a medical discharge from Bagram and why that discharge came 3 weeks after a sealed hearing that never made it into official records. She could see him through the window. Intubated. Chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. A man she'd once saluted in the field, once trusted with her life, once believed held some moral code that would protect them both. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and impersonal, and Katie's hands clenched into fists so tight her fingernails cut crescents into her palms. Noticed you lingering. Dr. Ashford's voice came from behind her, smooth as oil spreading across water. Katie turned to find him standing 3 feet away, his white coat pristine, his expression the kind of curiosity that looked like concern but felt like dissection. He'd been watching her watch Brennan. Of course he had. Room 4 is on my assignment, Katie said. Her voice came out even. This was the composure she'd learned to wear like a second skin, measured, deferential, the tone of someone who understood her place. I wanted to review the intake vitals. Of course. Dr. Ashford smiled. The smile of a man who believed he'd just confirmed something he'd been suspecting. Sergeant Brennan came in through trauma at 4:38 a.m. Multi-system injuries from a vehicle collision on IL-84. Unconscious on arrival. I'll be conducting rounds in 15 minutes. Family should be arriving shortly. Katie nodded and moved past him toward the medication cart. She could feel him watching her move, the weight of his attention like pressure against her spine. Brennan's sister and mother arrived at 8:15 a.m., their faces carved from shock and fear. They stood on either side of his bed, his mother's hand trembling as she held his intubated right hand, his sister's jaw locked tight as she stared at the monitor readout she couldn't interpret. Katie was checking his full line when Dr. Ashford entered with her chart, and she felt the shift in air pressure that meant his attention had sharpened into something predatory. Ladies, I'm Dr. Ashford, the attending on this service. He extended his hand to the mother first, the gesture calibrated for maximum reassurance. "Your son is stable, but I need to discuss his care with you." Katie kept her focus on the saline drip, her hand steady as a surgical laser, but she felt what was coming the way animals feel storms gathering on the horizon. Nurse Morrison documented his medication allergies incorrectly on intake, Dr. Ashford said, holding up the chart. An error that could have been catastrophic. He's documented as allergic to morphine, but his medical alert bracelet clearly lists fentanyl as the contraindication. This kind of carelessness, he paused, letting the weight of the word settle, can kill patients. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She simply turned to look at the chart he was holding, and every muscle in her body went still as she read her own notes. Morphine allergy. Listed exactly as she documented it from Brennan's admission paperwork. Exactly as it appeared in his file. The intake paperwork listed fentanyl. "Doctor," she said quietly. "I documented what was provided." "Then perhaps the intake paperwork is inaccurate." Dr. Ashford turned back to the mother with the expression of a man handling a delicate problem. "We'll get this sorted, but I want you to understand that your son's care depends on precise documentation. One error, one careless notation, and we lose the ability to protect him." The mother's face crumpled. The sister's eyes filled with angry tears. And Katie felt something shift inside her chest, something that tasted like copper and rage, but when she breathed it stayed internal. She took one measured breath. Felt the unit patch burn against her ribs. And met Dr. Ashford's eyes across the monitoring station with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst a person can endure. "I've survived worse than you, doctor," she said. Her voice came out soft. A single tear traced her cheek, not from fear, but from the effort of containment, the trembling that wasn't fear but restraint compressed until it had nowhere left to go. She wiped her face without breaking eye contact and turned back to her chart work. The family's distrust was now established. The seed had been planted. Katie could feel it blooming in the space between them, poisoning any trust she might have built during the careful efficiency of her care. 2 days later, Katie pushed through the break room door to find 5 nurses mid-conversation. The moment she entered, their voices cut off like someone had pulled a plug. Sarah Chen, who'd asked Katie for clinical advice on a difficult for placement just last week, suddenly remembered she needed to check on a discharge. Martinez mumbled something about a medication order. Within 30 seconds, Katie was alone in the room with half-drunk coffee cooling in paper cups and an open box of donuts leaking sugar onto the counter. Only the new graduate remained, uncomfortable in the silence, before making an excuse about the central line that needed monitoring. Katie sat down with her lunch, a salad she'd prepared at home, measured and controlled like everything else in her life, and ate in the humming company of the vending machine and her own steady breathing. She'd been isolated before. Had stood alone in deserts and been surrounded by nothing but sand and sky and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. This was nothing. Just the social calculus of a hospital unit where the attending had decided a nurse was a liability. The break room door opened again. Dr. Ashford stepped in, and Katie watched him note her solitary presence with the satisfaction of a chess player who'd just moved his rook into checkmate position. He poured coffee with the unhurried confidence of a man whose power was so absolute he didn't need to perform it loudly. "How are you settling in, Katie?" His use of her first name was deliberate, the intimacy false as plastic. "Fine, doctor," she said. "Good. Because I need you to understand something." He turned, coffee cup in hand, and his expression had shifted into something that looked almost paternal. "This unit is my responsibility. These patients are my responsibility. And when I notice inconsistencies in documentation, inventory discrepancies, medication observations outside your scope, I have an obligation to address them." Katie set down her fork. Waited. "There will be a formal write-up on the unit bulletin board this afternoon," he continued. "It's nothing personal. It's protocol. But I need the entire team to understand that we maintain standards here. That precision matters. That crossing into areas you're not trained for isn't heroism, it's negligence." After he left, Katie sat with her half-eaten salad and understood what she'd been avoiding for 6 weeks. The missing fentanyl from the Pyxis machine. The discrepancies in the morphine reconciliation that didn't match patient administration records. The pharmaceutical cost variance that any competent pharmacy tech should have flagged by now. Dr. Ashford wasn't worried about her noticing the inventory problems. He was warning her. He was preparing the ground for something that required her silence, her complicity, or her removal from a position where she could see. The write-up appeared at 10:33 a.m., pinned to the bulletin board in the medication area where every nurse, every tech, every resident would pass it multiple times per shift. Formal written warning for Nurse Katie Morrison regarding unauthorized observation and documentation of restricted medication inventory discrepancies, constituting scope creep and potential insubordination. Katie read it while 3 other nurses walked past, their eyes carefully averted. She understood the translation underneath the hospital language. Dr. Ashford had just made it clear that she was being watched. That her observations had been noted. That continuing to notice things would have consequences. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that over the past 2 days, she'd begun to understand why he needed Brennan gone. Why a Marine sergeant with classified medical clearance represented a threat. Why a man she'd sworn never to speak to again about what had happened in a sealed hearing room in Bagram had suddenly become the most dangerous person in this hospital. Because if Brennan woke up, if he was coherent, if anyone asked him about his pain management protocols or his medication history, and he mentioned that his documented allergy didn't match his chart, someone would start asking questions. Someone would audit Dr. Ashford's prescribing patterns. Someone would look at the Pyxis reconciliation reports and notice the pattern, the missing opioids, the discrepancies, the careful erasure of evidence hidden inside the chaos of a busy ICU. The next words out of his mouth would change everything. That night, Katie stayed past her shift and sat in the darkened medication area reviewing what records she could still access. She watched Dr. Ashford leave at 7:45 p.m., his briefcase held against his chest like a shield, and she understood with the clarity of someone who'd been trained to read people that he was afraid. Underneath the control, underneath the manipulation, something about Brennan's presence had triggered pure survival instinct. She just didn't yet know why it mattered that she understood it. Didn't know that 3 days from now, everything would break open, and a man she'd thought was destroyed by circumstance would be the one holding her life in his hands. Didn't know that staying silent about what she'd noticed would make her complicit in a crime, and speaking would cost her everything again. For now, she simply sat in the quiet of the medication room, felt the unit patch burn against her ribs, and made a choice that would echo through the rest of her life. The medication room was where Katie made her choice, and she made it in absolute silence. She sat on the cold metal stool between the locked cabinets, feeling the faded unit patch burn against her ribs like a brand pressed into flesh. The choice wasn't complicated, it was just impossible. Stay silent about what she'd witnessed in Dr. Ashford's diversion scheme and become complicit in his crime. Or speak and lose everything she'd rebuilt, the second time around. Some people called that a dilemma. Katie called it Tuesday. She clocked in at 18:47 hours the next evening without checking the schedule board first. That was her mistake. The printed roster was already posted outside the staff lounge, laminated and official, and her name had migrated to the permanent night shift column with no conversation, no email, no warning. 5 nights a week. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The opposite rotation from every colleague who might have warned her about inventory discrepancies or whispered when Dr. Ashford lingered too long near the narcotic lock. The isolation was textbook. Katie pulled the schedule down from the corkboard with 2 fingers, reading the notation at the bottom in Ashford's precise handwriting, reassignment effective immediately. Administrative necessity. No exceptions. No signature. No explanation. Just erasure. The break room was already clearing when she walked past the threshold that night. 3 nurses, Rodriguez, Chen, and Maldonado, had been laughing about something, and the laughter stopped like someone had cut the audio feed. They didn't greet her. They didn't acknowledge the schedule change. They simply gathered their half-empty coffee cups and drifted toward the hallway with the practiced ease of people who'd been warned. Someone had told them Katie Morrison was radioactive. She didn't flinch. She poured her own coffee from the pot that tasted like burnt copper and stood at the window overlooking the parking lot, watching the city lights blur through the rain that had started sometime between her car and the third floor. The coffee was cold by the time she finished it. She didn't care. But that wasn't the worst part. When Katie logged into the computer station to review patient charts at 2,100 hours, her access credentials hung on the login screen for 3 full seconds before rejecting her. Access denied. The message was clinical and absolute. She tried again. Same result. The third attempt locked her out entirely, triggered the security protocol, and sent a notification to the IT department that would log her name in a file somewhere. The nurse supervisor, Janet Morrison, no relation, emerged from the adjacent office with the expression of someone holding a grenade without the pin. "Your access has been restricted pending a compliance review," she said, and the words came out rehearsed, which meant Ashford had written them. "You can use the shared terminal if you need to pull patient information, but direct database access is suspended." Katie stared at the computer screen. Direct access suspension meant no reviewing medication records independently. No checking inventory logs without someone watching. No evidence gathering. No protection. How long? Katie's voice was steady, level, the voice of a combat medic who'd learned to keep tone separate from content. Dr. Ashford didn't specify a time frame. Janet was already backing toward her office. "I'm sure it's just temporary." It wasn't temporary. It was calculated. The shift stretched out in its new configuration, Katie assigned to the far end of the ICU, away from the medication room, away from Brennan's room where he lay deteriorating by degrees, his oxygen requirements climbing as his body fought an infection that was winning. She could see his room from the supply station, room for 12, second bed from the east wall, but the angle was wrong, the distance too far, and Dr. Ashford had made sure of that. When she passed the nurse's station during rounds, conversation scattered like frightened birds. When she approached the break room, colleagues invented reasons to leave, urgent calls, bathroom breaks, charts that suddenly needed immediate attention elsewhere. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical reassurance. The heart monitors beeped in their individual cadences, and Katie moved through the unit like a ghost who clocked in and out but didn't quite exist in the space between. At 0345 hours, Katie found the transfer paperwork. She wasn't looking for it. She was restocking the central supply cart, the midnight task that no one wanted, the work that kept her moving through hallways that had already decided she was invisible. Dr. Ashford's office door was open, a rare thing, and the desk lamp cast a pool of yellow light across scattered documents. Patient files. Insurance forms. And a transfer request form, already half completed, with Brennan's name across the top in Dr. Ashford's precise block letters. Transfer to VA Medical Center, Roseburg, Oregon. 98 miles. Pediatric facility specialization, psychiatric care and rehabilitation. The destination was wrong for a Marine with a traumatic brain injury and active infection. The facility was wrong. The timing was wrong. Everything about it screamed that Brennan needed to be somewhere other than Seattle General the moment before someone with actual authority started asking questions about medication inventory. Katie photographed the form with her personal phone, 3 angles, making sure the handwriting and date were visible, and slipped back into the hallway. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart rate didn't spike. The composure that had kept her alive in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, held steady now in a hospital corridor at 0350 in the morning while she became complicit in documenting a conspiracy she couldn't report without exposing herself. The door to the break room was locked when she tried it 5 minutes later, which was impossible because break room doors didn't lock from the outside. Katie stood there for a moment, processing that deliberate exclusion, and then turned back toward her assigned territory at the opposite end of the unit. Ashford was waiting at the medication room entrance. He stood with his shoulders relaxed, his expression composed, the posture of someone whose strategic moves were executing flawlessly. He'd positioned himself directly between Katie and any access to the controlled substances, the inventory logs, the paper trail that might explain why fentanyl counts didn't match requisition forms. "The access restriction is part of your compliance review," he said, and his voice carried the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "I need you to understand that the measures being taken are necessary. This unit has standards." Katie met his eyes and held them for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to communicate that she understood his message, short enough to avoid the appearance of challenging. "Understood, Dr. Ashford." "Good." He stepped aside just far enough to let her pass, a gesture meant to signal that his control was absolute, that he could grant or restrict her movement as he chose. "I'm requesting a transfer for Sergeant Brennan to a facility with better psychiatric resources. He's not responding well to his ICU stay. The instability will pass faster with specialized intervention." Katie didn't ask why a trauma Marine with an active infection needed psychiatric intervention. She didn't ask why a 98-mile transfer was being scheduled on his chart. She simply nodded and continued to the supply room, feeling the weight of his observation settle across her shoulders like something with teeth. At 0600, when the day shift began arriving, Katie watched Dr. Ashford pull the unit director, Thomas Chen, into a closed-door conference room. Through the glass partition, she could see the conversation, Ashford speaking with the kind of intensity that suggested urgent concern, his hands moving in gestures that emphasized seriousness, his mouth forming words that would later appear in formal documentation. By 0630, when Katie signed out, Chen had already updated Brennan's status as a pending transfer. By 0700, the transfer request had moved from Ashford's desk to the authorization queue. By 0900, the paperwork had been signed by 3 separate administrators who'd never spoken to Katie, never reviewed her documentation of Brennan's declining mental status, never asked why a patient with a tension-prone injury was being relocated across state lines without attending physician consultation. The system had moved exactly as Dr. Ashford had engineered it. Katie sat in her car in the Seattle General parking lot for 47 minutes after the end of her shift, watching the rain streak the windshield, feeling the faded unit patch burn against her ribs. The strategic sabotage had escalated past social isolation into institutional weaponization. Ashford wasn't just trying to silence her anymore. He was systematically removing the one person who could stop him from completing whatever transfer was actually planned, and Katie's gut, the same instinct that had saved lives in Bagram, was screaming that Brennan's transfer was a one-way trip dressed up in medical necessity. She'd survived the court-martial that ended her career. She'd survived rebuilding her life beneath a stranger's name and a dead soldier's borrowed ID. But watching another person get destroyed by the same system that had already broken her once, watching it happen because she was afraid to risk her second chance at anonymity, that was a threshold she'd never expected to find again. The choice she'd made in the medication room suddenly felt like the wrong choice, and Katie Morrison sat alone in the rain with her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white and realized she'd already crossed a line she couldn't walk back across. 3 days into Brennan's deteriorating condition, the ICU felt like the calm before an ambush, oxygen saturation dropping, fever climbing, his lungs filling with fluid despite aggressive antibiotics. Katie had monitored his decline from the periphery, careful to stay out of Ashford's line of sight, documenting vitals in the patient chart without commentary. That was when she overheard the conversation that made everything click into place. Ashford stood outside Brennan's room with Dr. Marcus Chen, the attending physician, his voice pitched low but carrying the particular intensity of someone whose calculation has been exposed. "He needs to transfer," Ashford said. "VA facility in Salem. Better isolation protocols." Chen's frown deepened. "We have isolation here. Our protocols are identical. The equipment there is more specialized." Ashford's hands moved in small, precise gestures. 2-hour transport. They specialize in complicated pneumonia cases. Thomas, he's my patient. His chest imaging is improving. Vitals are trending stabilized. Chen crossed his arms. "There's no clinical reason to move him now." Katie felt the recognition bloom cold in her chest. The fentanyl log showed a 487 mg discrepancy across the past 8 days. Ashford's insistence on moving Brennan, the only witness to his crimes who'd been awake and lucid enough to notice medication timing, made a terrible kind of sense. Get the Marine 2 hours away, where the new facility's protocols wouldn't catch the gap in documentation, where the transfer would blur records, where a drug-impaired patient with infection and pneumonia might deteriorate further without proper continuity of care. Someone with the right clearance, someone from a federal task force or a JAG investigator, might eventually correlate the medication discrepancy with Brennan's transfer, but by then, Ashford would have months of plausible deniability and a paper trail manufactured to look like routine care. But that wasn't the worst part. Ashford must have finally recognized who Katie really was. The way she'd moved during the last crisis, the specific way she'd called for equipment, the precision in her hands. He knew she'd logged that medication observation, knew she was a liability, and moving Brennan was also moving away from a witness who could confirm Katie had documentation. She was expendable. The puzzle assembled itself with the inevitability of a trap closing. Chen's pager chirped. He glanced at it, shook his head. We keep him here. If his condition changes, we reassess. But he's staying. Ashford's jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jump from 20 feet away. He turned and walked toward the medication room, his shoulders rigid with the kind of fury that comes from losing leverage. The crash came at 1,447 hours, 14 minutes into the transport prep when Ashford's orderlies were moving Brennan's bed toward the elevator. Katie was at the supply station when the monitor's shrill alarm pierced through the ICU like a fire alarm. She moved before thought could catch up, muscle memory from field hospitals under mortar fire, from moments when thinking got people killed. Brennan's eyes were open, panicked, his chest heaving against the bed rails. The ventilator tube pulled taut as he gasped. Tracheal deviation. Jugular veins distended like rope. Tension pneumothorax, the collapsed lung pressing against his heart, squeezing it, killing him in real time. Get him back. Katie's voice cut through the chaos like a command that had no right to exist in a Portland hospital, and the orderlies froze. She was at his bedside before anyone else moved, her hands already moving, assessing. The needle gauge on the crash cart, 14, 16, too large, too blunt for the thin space between ribs that needed penetration without tissue damage. Seconds bleeding away. 45 seconds from pneumothorax to cardiac arrest. Maybe 60 if Brennan's military conditioning had given him better circulation than average. Ashford appeared at the crash cart, his hands trembling as he reached for the decompression needle. The tremor wasn't fear. It was the specific quality of panic that comes from watching your exit strategy collapse in real time. Step back, Katie said, and Ashford's hands froze. Brennan's personal effects bag hung on the bedside chair, the one she'd packed with him during the transfer prep. MRE packages. Katie tore the bag open, hand steady, grabbed the first package her fingers found. The plastic crinkled loud as a gunshot in the silence. A moment of complete clarity, her scissors on the supply cart, the emergency crew gathering, Brennan's oxygen saturation climbing from the red zone into the orange, Chen preparing the tube for emergency decompression through the chest wall. She ripped the MRE packaging open, the plastic sharp against her palms, and cut a 4-inch square with precise movements that belonged to someone who'd done this before, in places where there was no equipment, only survival. Tape, now! Her voice was different. Lower. Carrying authority that came from somewhere deeper than her nurse's station ID. Someone bag him, push air in, not out. Get that tube ready. Move. The room snapped into alignment like iron filings toward a magnet. A resident grabbed tape, medical grade, strong, adhesive side out. Katie pressed the improvised occlusive dressing against Brennan's decompressed chest wall, creating the seal that would stop air from inflating the space around his heart, her palm firm and steady against his ribs. The plastic held. The seal was airtight. Brennan's oxygen saturation began to climb. 68, 71, 76, 82. His breathing synchronized with the ventilator's assist, the crisis bleeding away into something manageable. His eyes fluttered open, confused, disoriented, but alive, and for just 1 second, they locked on Katie's face. She saw the exact moment recognition flickered through his morphine-hazed consciousness. Not the nurse. The Major. The one he destroyed to save the mission. Ashford's face drained of color, not with relief but with the cold calculation of someone watching his leverage evaporate. He stepped back from the bedside, his hands dropping to his sides, and Katie felt the shift in the room's geometry. He understood now. Whatever discipline Katie had maintained, whatever mask she'd worn, it had just come off in front of the entire ICU staff and a senior attending physician. The seizure of normalcy lasted exactly 47 minutes. Brennan was stabilized, transferred to step-down care, his vitals climbing back toward baseline. Katie completed her charting with mechanical precision, her hands moving through the motions while the room's energy shifted around her in ways she could feel but not yet process. Whispers. Glances. The resident who'd called for tape earlier catching her eye with something that looked like fear. At 16:34, the unit secretary handed her a printed envelope. HR summons. Termination letter. The language was precise, bureaucratic, weaponized with professionalism, gross overstepping of scope of practice, performing unauthorized medical procedures outside the nurse's defined role, insubordination, and actions resulting in potential patient safety risks. Ashford stood at the far end of the ICU corridor, not looking at her, pretending to study a chart on the wall. But she felt his attention like weight. She'd revealed herself, and he'd documented her doing it, and the system that had protected him so far would now protect him from her. The rain started as she walked toward the parking lot, Portland's winter falling in sheets that turned the asphalt into black glass. Katie sat at the bus stop with the cardboard box from her locker balanced against her legs, 12 years' worth of a carefully constructed anonymous life, all of it now fitting inside something a department store could print in 60 seconds. The cracked ceramic mug from the unit windowsill rattled against a dying succulent. A photograph of her medical team from Bagram, half the faces faded by time and chlorine from countless hospital washings. The photo was in her hands, water-spotted from the rain, when she heard footsteps splashing through puddles. Her son appeared through the downpour like a hallucination, breathless from running, soaked through his school jacket, 16 and shaking and holding a shadow box with the kind of reverence people usually reserved for holy relics. The metals inside caught the streetlight, ribbon bars, medals suspended on fabric that had been folded with military precision. His hands trembled as he held it toward her. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked like he was asking permission for something impossible. "Mom, they need to see these." Katie's mouth opened. Closed. The protest died somewhere between her ribs and her throat. "Come with me." Her son turned back toward Seattle General's entrance, and every tactical instinct in her body screamed at her to refuse, to protect what was left, to preserve the anonymous life that was already burning. Instead, she stood. The rain soaked through her sweater like an omen. Her son reached out and took the box from her hands, and they walked back through those sliding doors together, back toward the hospital that had just destroyed her, back toward the evidence that she'd always been so much more than they'd ever been allowed to see. Within an hour of Brennan's stabilization, the intercom crackled with Katie's name. Not a request. A summons. She knew the cadence of institutional violence by then, the careful timing, the paperwork already prepared, the HR office already notified. She walked through the hallway with the same measured pace she'd used crossing minefields, breathing through the tightness in her chest, because showing fear was surrender and she was not finished yet. The termination letter sat centered on the desk like a weapon. Overstepping scope of practice. Unauthorized procedures. Violation of chain of command. Every phrase surgical in its precision, designed to make her intervention sound like arrogance rather than what it was, the only thing that had kept a United States Marine alive when every protocol would have let him die. Dr. Ashford stood near the window, his expression arranged into something that resembled regret, and Katie understood in that moment what competent villainy looked like. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't dramatic. He was efficient. "I've given you every opportunity to operate within appropriate boundaries, Major," he said, and the word hung there like a blade, Major, spoken with the precision of someone who'd known all along, who'd been watching, who'd been waiting for her to break her own cover. What you did in that trauma bay was a direct violation of ICU protocol. I have no choice but to recommend immediate termination. Katie's hands remained steady as she signed the paper. One signature. One line. The erasure of everything she'd rebuilt. She didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't even look at his face. Instead, she pulled the laminated hospital ID from around her neck and placed it on the desk with a soft click of plastic on mahogany, and that small sound was the loudest thing she'd ever done. Rain hammered the parking lot as she stepped through the sliding doors for the last time as an employee. The sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple-gray, heavy with pressure. She stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box they'd given her, the one containing 12 years of night shifts distilled into objects, a cracked mug with a faded Seattle Space Needle, a dying succulent that had somehow survived 3 years of her intermittent watering, and a photograph from Bagram, her medical team standing outside the combat surgical hospital, 16 faces arranged in 2 rows, 8 of them now gone to IEDs and friendly fire and the kinds of wounds that didn't come home. She didn't cry. The rain was already soaking through her sweater, already running down her face in rivulets that looked like tears to anyone watching, and there was a kind of mercy in that. A figure emerged from the curtain of rain, moving fast, breath coming in hard bursts. Her son. 16 years old, lanky in the way teenage boys were, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and clutched against his chest like a lifeline was a shadow box, the one she'd kept hidden in the garage wrapped in canvas and masking tape, the one marked in her own handwriting, "Do not open." "Mom, they need to see these," he said, barely able to form the words through the running. He wasn't asking permission. Wasn't giving her a choice. Just like she'd taught him. They need to know. Something shifted in her then, some carefully sealed compartment cracking open, but Katie didn't let him see it. Instead, she took the box from his hands and felt the weight of it, medals, ribbons, citations, the material evidence of a life she'd spent 7 years trying to forget. The rain continued hammering down as they stood together, mother and son, one holding the past and one ready to carry it forward, and then Katie turned and walked back through those sliding doors. The board had convened in a closed conference room, leather chairs arranged in a semicircle, cups of coffee cooling on the mahogany table. The CEO was there, the chief of surgery, the director of nursing, and Dr. Ashford at the head of the arrangement like a king surveying his kingdom, his expression already shifting into the posture of victory. The doors opened without anyone knocking. Katie's son stepped through first, moving with a purpose that made the room fall silent, and he walked directly to the table and placed the shadow box down with the weight of revelation. "My mother is Major Katie Morrison, Marine Corps," he said, and his voice cracked on the words but held steady, and the room stopped breathing. He opened the shadow box and turned it so they could all see. "These are what you fired today." The citations came first, read aloud by a nurse Katie had trained 3 years ago, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the laminated paper. Bronze Star with Valor. The board members leaned forward. Purple Heart. The coffee cup sat forgotten. 2 purple hearts. Someone gasped. And then Sergeant Cole Brennan stood up from the chair where he'd been watching, his dress uniform immaculate despite the bandaging visible beneath the collar, his chest tube taped carefully out of sight, and he moved to stand beside the shadow box with the precision of someone performing a ceremony. "Bronze Star with Valor," Brennan said, his voice carrying the cadence of parade ground precision. "Awarded for exceptional heroism while serving as a combat medical officer." He touched the ribbon. Purple Heart. Combat-related injury, Helmand Province, 2017. His voice didn't waver but his hand did, just barely. Second Purple Heart. Sane deployment. December. And then the final medal, the one that made the room go so quiet you could hear the rain against the windows, the one that had cost her everything. Navy Cross. For extracting 12 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire at Forward Operating Base Shank, Bagram, July 2018. Provided surgical intervention under active mortar attack. Prevented confirmed enemy capture of coalition personnel. His voice broke on the last sentence, and when he spoke again, the words came out barely audible. The court-martial wasn't about what she did. It was a cover. She compromised a classified operation by being too good at her job. Being too brave. Command couldn't acknowledge what happened, so they buried her instead. A Navy SEAL Commander Katie didn't recognize Rose from the back of the room, his movement economical and controlled, the kind of stillness that came from training designed to make operators invisible. The FBI has been investigating Dr. Ashford's medication diversion network for 14 months, he said quietly. We have financial records, pharmacy access logs, patient administration falsification across 47 cases spanning 18 months. Major Morrison's observations were the evidence that completed our investigation. Without her documentation, we would still be building the case. And then Marcus Webb stepped forward, the IT specialist who'd worked in the basement of Seattle General for 9 years, the one who never spoke in the cafeteria, the one everyone forgot was there. He opened a laptop and turned the monitor toward the board, and Katie's breath caught because Marcus had been there that first week, had nodded at her when she'd asked about old server backups, and had somehow known, the way veteran eyes always knew other veteran eyes, that she was someone who needed quiet respect. Dr. Ashford attempted to delete the medication room surveillance footage at 0647 this morning, Marcus said, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone trained in the military's network operations. I preserved the files and forwarded them to the FBI at 0652. He didn't know the system auto-backs up to a secure partition every 30 minutes. The security footage played across the monitor like a confession. Dr. Ashford accessing the Pyxis medication dispensing system, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency, overriding protocols, the little orange bottles of fentanyl disappearing into his pocket, digital records being altered to show administration to patients who never received the medication. Frame after frame of systematic theft, his face clear and unmistakable in each one, the kind of evidence that didn't require interpretation. Dr. Ashford's expression shifted then, the carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. His hands clenched. His jaw tightened. The confidence drained from his face and left something raw and desperate underneath. The chief legal counsel made a phone call that lasted exactly 11 seconds, and when she hung up, she nodded to security. I built this unit, Dr. Ashford said, his voice rising, his strategic calm finally shattering like the glass of a control he'd held for so long. I made this program what it is. You're destroying a career because a washed-up trauma case decided to play hero nurse. You have no idea what you've done. But his words landed in empty air. The board members had already turned away. The FBI agent was reading rights. Brennan moved to stand beside Katie with the kind of quiet solidarity that spoke louder than any statement, and Dr. Ashford's institutional power, that careful edifice of authority and manipulation, crumbled in real time. The security guards took his arms with the gentleness of men who'd been trained to do difficult things, and he was gone from the room with the same efficiency he'd once used to build his empire. Marcus revealed the rest of it methodically, text messages between Ashford and a pharmaceutical diversion network operating out of Tacoma, financial records showing deposits totaling $847,000 over 18 months, patient files documenting falsified pain medication administration to veterans and active duty personnel who'd already sacrificed pieces of themselves. The hospital IT specialist had preserved everything with the care of someone who understood that documentation was everything, that evidence was love, in a way, love for people who deserved truth. Some of those patients suffered unnecessarily, Katie said quietly, her first word since entering the room, and the voice that emerged was different now, lower, carrying authority that came from places the room couldn't see. Marines. Veterans. People who'd already given enough. He diverted their prescribed analgesics because addiction is profitable and pain management isn't. They suffered because he chose theft over compassion. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Dr. Ashford disappeared into the federal system 3 months later, sentenced to 6 years federal prison and permanent loss of medical licensure. Katie learned through the hospital newsletter, of all places, that after serving for years he'd been released to a halfway house in South Portland, and then found work as a night security guard at the sister hospital across town, the one 20 minutes away where nobody knew his name. She imagined him checking visitor badges night after night, watching security camera feeds, his former colleagues passing through the lobby without acknowledgement, moving through space like a ghost in places he used to own. 3 days after her reinstatement as clinical director, a Marine honor guard arrived at her apartment at 0800 hours sharp. The presidential letter bore the official seal in gold foil, inviting Major Katie Morrison to the White House to receive the commendation her classified service had delayed for 7 years. The ceremony that should have happened in 2019. The recognition that command had buried along with her career. She stood before the mirror in her dress blues for the first time since Bagram, her son helping her align the ribbons and medals in their proper sequence, and then she found the faded unit patch she'd kept hidden inside her jacket lining all these years and finally sewed it onto her uniform where it belonged, each stitch an act of reclamation, each pull of the needle through fabric a resurrection. She stood at the White House with her son beside her, one hand resting on that patch, and felt the weight of 7 years finally lift. I need you to recognize the hidden heroes in your own institutions. The quiet ones. The ones carrying more than anyone knows. Subscribe, hit that like button, and comment with a story about someone you've underestimated who turned out to be exactly who needed to save you.